I work with writers across dozens of genres and disciplines at UT, 12 colleges and schools, pretty much every discipline that teaches some kind of form of writing. And because of my teaching experience, also, I've covered every stage of writing development from early childhood all the way up to professional authorship. So I have a very big picture perspective on how people's writing skills progress over time. The research that I'm going to talk to you about today comes from the field of cognitive psychology, and it's pretty abstract, but it helps to make sense of what I have observed as an actual writer and person who works with writers. So I just want to stress that as we get into the kind of the system that we're talking about here, this framework, the cognitive psychologists who do this work, they don't explicitly recommend the things that I'll be recommending to you. And they wouldn't necessarily make the same connections that I do. They tend to work in a laboratory. They test people in very controlled ways. My concern here is less with a strict application of science and replicating research, and more with using the research to create a framework that helps us understand what we see in student writing, and that gives us some specific tools for constructing useful interventions as we teach. So that's the goal tonight. And to do that, I'm going to see if I can advance the slides. Yay, that worked. The two questions that I want to focus on in this presentation are, first of all, a big picture. How do people develop into good writers? What actually happens inside the brain as we write and as we become better at writing? And then the second question is more of a zoomed in close-up question. Wherever the writer is, how can we help that individual student move forward on that developmental arc? So we'll talk about how we communicate with students about their writing, and what we can do and what we can have them do to progress as writers. So this approach hopefully lets us see a sort of universal trajectory for the vast majority of writers, but it also gives us guidance in developing and choosing individual interventions. I like to start these sessions by asking, what are the characteristics of your students' writing that most frustrate or concern you? You know, the one or two things that when you see it in your students' writing, you're like, ah, that's got to change. What are the things that you worry about? What are the things that you stress about? If you could just take a moment to share one or two of those in the chat, that would be super helpful, because what we usually see as we go through this material is that you start to see how those concerns are linked to certain developmental thresholds and developmental tasks that students have to master. So take a minute and put that into the chat. There's a certain same as I tend to see similar things over and over again. So I'm always curious to see if something new will come up, or if it's still kind of the perennial favorites that people worry about in their students' writing. Okay, so sorry, you just got a little beep tone there, I hope. All right. Cognitive development and writing skill is a research area that has been developed in cognitive psychology since at least the 60s and 70s, I think. Ronald Kellogg is the researcher whose work I rely on most heavily. And he's building on the work of earlier practitioners. He started publishing stuff that I started paying attention to around 2005, I think. What they have found in the course of this research is writing skill typically develops over the course of about 2 decades of a person's life. Roughly 10,000 hours of practice is the metric. And that's similar to what we see for someone who's going to master the violin, for example, or become a very good chess player. And what the scientists have noted in researching this is that as a writer's skill progresses, the type and the amount of work that are performed by the writer's brain change. So the activity in the brain of a novice writer looks very different from the activity in the brain of an expert writer. 2 things that I want to point out that are important to us as teachers here is that first point, writing skill takes about 10,000 hours to develop. You can't give them 10,000 hours of practice. So it's important to be realistic as a teacher of just how much really you can expect to see the needle move with any given student. You may have them for 15 weeks or for 9 months, and we're gonna hopefully move them along. But what you can do in that amount of time is teach them habits and motivate them to continue to put in those hours over the course of 2 decades, because that's really what it takes. The other thing I want to stress is that these stages that we're going to spend some time talking about, they don't necessarily have clear-cut beginnings and endings. You don't just stop being a novice writer and become an adult writer. It depends what context you're writing in. And so you can have even expert writers' skills will regress. For example, if they're writing about content that is unfamiliar to them, or they're addressing an audience that they don't really know very well. So there's some back and forth and some regression across these stages that we're gonna discuss. And every time I try to change slides, I get a little error tone. All right, but here's the next one. So a writer's brain gradually learns to handle more tasks simultaneously and at higher levels of complexity. That's what goes on as you learn to write. And then the writer, the whole person, also learns more behaviors and techniques that help the brain to function at this higher level. Cognitive psychologists, because of just what they do, they focus primarily on the brain activity, but experts in writing instruction have observed this parallel behavioral development. Brain activity, we're talking about things like matching vocabulary to mental concepts, spelling words correctly, physically writing the words, constructing a sentence with a subject and a verb, things like that. Some of the behaviors that we are concerned with are as basic as learning that you should start early and then go back and look at what you've written and revise it. So where text talks about recursive practices, it's those habits that we want to build. Some of these kind of behavioral things are more technical, but they start to move into brain activity as they become what Kellogg and the cognitive psychologists would call automated. The tasks become automated in the brain. So that would be something like, at a very basic level as a writer, you have to physically think about how to move the pencil to form each letter, and you have to think about which letter comes next in every word that you write. But as you practice and gain experience, that becomes less of a load on your prefrontal cortex. You can remember how to spell words until you hit your 50s. You can do that. And you know how to write, or you know how to touch type, and that's kind of coded in, and you don't have to spend a lot of brain energy on it. So that's kind of the two types of growth that we have to work with here. Cognitive scientists basically rough out 3 general stages in this progression, from novice to maturity to expert writer. And the progress through the stages, as I said, is not uniform. We'll often see traits from more than one stage in a single piece of writing, and the skills can regress at times. Regression is typically due to new context or content or audiences. It's more the direction that's important. You want to be moving students forward wherever they happen to be at any given moment. All right, these are the 3 stages as Kellogg describes them in his writing. He sees the novice writer progressing from a stage that he calls knowledge telling, that's where we all come in, to a stage that he calls knowledge transforming, and that's characteristic of adult writers. Kellogg then says that adult writers can go on to this 3rd stage that he calls knowledge crafting. And this is one place where I differ from him. I don't think that knowledge crafting activity, what he's describing in the brain, is solely the province of expert writers. I see it in writers of many levels, and it's an important skill for an expert writer to have, but it is not something that develops necessarily just at the end of the journey. It starts coming in pretty early, and you can build an awareness of it fairly early for all writers. We'll talk about how to do that. But what Bereiter and Scardamaglia are 2 researchers from the 70s who Kellogg was building on their work. What they say is important about understanding these stages is the key distinction among them lies in how knowledge is brought into the writing process and in what happens to knowledge in the process. So we're not thinking about writing as just the reporting of ideas, but the building of new ones, of taking in knowledge and putting it together in more complex relationships and then expressing that clearly. So that the ability to do that is what distinguishes these stages of writing, one from another. The brain gains the ability to do more of that kind of work. Here is a visual representation. If you're not really a visual learner and you find this distracting, feel free to ignore it. But I kind of like these little thought bubble representations of the stages here. So I'm going to go through them. The vertical axis is your level of writing skill, increasing as we go up. And the horizontal axis is skills development over time. So we have our knowledge telling, our knowledge transforming, and our knowledge crafting stages. And this arc then is how we sort of see the skill development happening. If you look at this first stage, knowledge telling, what we have in that little bubble, you can think of it as a sort of specific conception or understanding of the text being produced. So part of the developmental process involves building the ability to see the text from more than one perspective, and the ability to comprehend multiple representations of the text simultaneously. So what that means is at the knowledge telling stage, I sit down to write something, and my concept of what the text is that I'm making is whatever is in my head that I want to say. I have an author's understanding of the text, and that's sort of what I work with. When I move to the knowledge transforming stage, I add back a second layer to that. I'm now thinking about what I want to say and what the page says back to me. Don't worry, we're going to unpack this in a lot more detail in just a sec. And then in the knowledge crafting stage here at the end, I have active in my brain both this author representation, what I want to say. I have an understanding that we also have this text, which is a separate thing from me. And I have a third understanding or awareness of the text, which is this thing that the reader is going to read and react to in a certain way. So that's kind of the three balls that an expert writer has to juggle in their brain as they're writing: the reader, author, and text representations. And I like to point out, if you've ever taught Aristotle's rhetorical triangle, that those three representations map pretty well to ethos, pathos, and logos, which is kind of interesting that the brain researchers have found very similar arrangements in the brain that the work is doing to what Aristotle described. The text, I think, has this wonderfully dry description of the interconnected nature of listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking. But that's really what we're looking at here when we see this very high level of activity going on in the brain. Okay, so let's dig into the stages. The first stage, knowledge telling, is using writer to tell what the author knows. Very basic. This is where we all start out. In the brain, the planning activity that goes on as the writing happens is generally limited to idea retrieval. I'm just searching my memory for what I want to say, and I'm putting it into words, and I'm writing that down. The ideas really don't change much as they're retrieved from memory and translated to the page. And reviewing and revising activity are minimal at this stage of writing. So this is the first kind of writing that most children do. And an example would be, on my happiest birthday ever, we had cake and presents, and my grandma was there, right? This is what I remember about it. The recall process that the brain uses is very similar to that used in oral conversation, when we're just talking to one another. And the end result is generally just a restatement of the writer's thoughts. Here's a thing that I thought, and I wrote it down, and that's my text, and that's what it is. So one thing I like to point out here is that this is exactly the kind of activity required by most timed writing tasks and standardized writing tests. So our students tend to be really good at this, but they have a tendency to get stuck here. And this kind of writing can evolve to the point where it's incorporating outside sources. So you can, in addition to retrieving things from memory, you can retrieve them from, for example, Wikipedia, and plop those down on the page. But again, the ideas do not change much as they are translated to the page. So that often gives you what we call sometimes a data dump paper. Students do need to practice this level of writing, and they need to get good at it before they can move on. As Kellogg would say, they need to automate the tasks of idea retrieval and vocabulary selection and sentence construction and all that. So they do need to do a lot of this before they can advance, but we don't want them stuck here, and we don't want them to think that this is all writing is. All right, so moving on to the next stage, knowledge transforming. Here we have some additional work going on in the brain. All right, so the brain is retrieving ideas and forming them into sentences. And at the same time, the writer now starts to consider whether the text that's put down on the page says what she wanted it to say, and whether she herself actually agrees with what the text says. And in the process, the writer contemplates not only changes in the text, but changes in what she might want to say. So with our earlier example about the birthday party, a writer might contemplate that and be thinking about, that was my happiest birthday, but you know, when I think about that feeling, it wasn't just happiness. There was another nuance to it. One reason I was in such a good mood was that my uncle didn't come to the party, and I was afraid of him. And that's one reason I had a good time. All right, so this stage is marked by an awareness that once the ideas are written down, the text becomes something apart from the writer with a separate existence. And the writer is beginning to comprehend the powerful recursive effect that writing can have upon the writer. I wrote these two sentences, and now I can see there's a connection between these two ideas, or there's a contrast or a contradiction. And I hadn't noticed that when they were just two discrete things floating around in my brain. Or I wrote these words, and now I see some latent meaning in them that I hadn't originally intended. And maybe I want to explore that meaning. Maybe that meaning is closer to what I wanted to say in the first place. Maybe it's more important to express that meaning than the one I originally intended. I like to say that you spot this activity frequently in teens and preteens when they start writing poetry, because they put some ideas down on paper and they look at it and they have this moment where they suddenly realize, my goodness, I am a much more profound person than I had ever realized, because they see the words on the page and there's more there than they thought they were putting into it. So it's a very exciting moment. One thing that is really critical about it as we try to develop these students into mature writers is note that now choice becomes a factor here. I'm not just reporting something out of my memory. I have opened up some divergent possibilities, and I'm going to have to make some decisions about the best path. So do I want to talk about the way I felt about my uncle? Do I want to go there? Is that something that's important to what I'm writing? Do I feel comfortable sharing that? What's my audience going to think about it? And that can be a paralyzing experience, especially for students who typically see the job of writing as a process of avoiding mistakes and punishment. And in the educational system that we have, that's a very common mindset for students. So you have to make it worthwhile to the student to explore these other paths that are cropping up in their text. They have to be able to see them, and they have to have the confidence to follow them a ways and see if they might be worthwhile. If they find writing uncomfortable and painful, and if they lack confidence in the reception their writing will get, they will resist the work of exploring divergent creative possibilities at this stage. And what they'll do instead is they'll learn to mimic development through repetition, through quoting, and maybe adopting a few stock phrases that they can throw in here and there to sort of sound reflective. So the writer now has a choice in knowledge transforming. They see in the page that the words are opening up possibilities. They can choose to amend the text or not, and they can choose any of an infinite number of ways to change it. So as our writing skill progresses and our ideas become more complicated, we have more opportunities and more choices and more control, but that requires us to give up some of our sense of safety and of doing the correct thing. And I also want to point out, this is not the kind of activity that we typically associate with timed writing and testing. On timed tests, you don't really want to change what you think, right? You want to pick something and then you want to throw your evidence in there and do that. But it is what we want them to do well in college. So it is part of human growth and development. This is the way writing actually can make you smarter. So it comes to a certain extent with maturity, but writing is one of the ways that we achieve this maturity as well. So it's really important to highlight it and explain it to students as important growth. And again, the text just says that students need to learn to generate ideas through a range of strategies such as brainstorming and journaling. And I just want to point out, those are strategies. You can teach them as behaviors, but they also start to foment this activity in the brain that will get students thinking about what they are saying and wanting to say and able to say very differently from the way they did as a knowledge teller. Okay, also with knowledge transforming, the act of writing becomes a way of building new representations of knowledge rather than simply retrieving old ones. So we're gonna make something new here. In the brain, there is now extensive interaction going on among planning, how are I going to fit ideas together? Where's there space to add new things? Language generation, I may have to come up with new terms to describe relationships that hadn't occurred to me before, and reviewing activity. So then I said this thing, now I got to go back and look at it again and see if it still makes sense from start to finish in my sentence. And the text that you end up with is a greatly condensed version of the author's thought process, but there's evidence of a process to the thinking, not just retrieval from memory. So when and college professors do this all the time, so I'm sure that you do too. When we say that a student's writing lacks depth or development, it's this threshold that we're noticing they haven't crossed. And the text standards refer to this as developing an engaging idea reflecting depth of thought with specific details, examples, and commentary. And certainly detail, example, and commentary are important ways to develop these things. But again, they've got to see that opening in the text in order to start to be able to do this. And to get there, they have to learn to see this, look at a knowledge telling text and see possibilities for transforming that knowledge, which is why this stage is called knowledge transforming. Okay, stage 3, knowledge crafting. Again, Kellogg says this is an expert level stage. I wouldn't call it that. I see students knowledge crafting every day at all kinds of levels. It has a lot to do with audience awareness. So at this 3rd stage, while the writer is composing and reviewing, they also imagine with a very high degree of specificity how a reader is likely to interpret the text. And this idea comes from Walter Ong. Ong says that writers have to be able to correctly anticipate all the ways in which a reader might misunderstand them. So that involves everything from shared values. Is this audience likely to immediately jump to assumptions about trauma if I talk about how I was afraid of my uncle? Am I speaking to an audience of social workers, for example? All the way down to things like, will this clause confuse them if I put it here? Do I need to move it somewhere else? Can they tell which noun this adjective is modifying? So the writer has to anticipate the needs of the audience. Both of the already established representations of the text are analyzed for potential reader interpretation at this stage. So you have those two, you're juggling those two bubbles. Here's the text that was in my head. Here's the text that ended up on the page. And now you're thinking, how is a reader going to react to these things? How will they interpret it? So being able to predict how an audience is going to react to images we present, how they'll navigate a sentence, that requires imagination and empathy. And those are skills that have to be built over time. That's a maturation process. And that provides a clue as to how we should respond as instructors when we're working with student writing. So this is kind of my magnetic north whenever I work with writers. I always want to respond first as a reader. In my experience, nothing moves students more reliably along the path of writing skill than simply reading what they've written, reading it out loud, reading it word for word, and then having a conversation about sort of what went through my mind as I read it, to make real for them that 3rd representation of the text. Here's what a reader actually thought of this text. Here's what they thought you meant. Here's how they reacted to it. And the text standards refer to the appropriate purpose, audience, topic, and context. And we tend to think of those, or it's easy to think of those as fairly dry, formulaic things, such as I'm writing a job application letter, so I'm writing for a potential employer, or I'm writing for an audience of cognitive psychologists, or I'm writing for an audience who reads the opinion section of the newspaper. But there are many, many different types of audiences, and students have to learn not just, you can't memorize every one of them. You can't learn every single type of audience you might adjust to. You have to sort of learn to imagine and guess based on what you know from previous audiences. So starting them with whatever audience you can get them is what's going to do them the most good. Okay, make sure I hit all my notes there. All right, so how can we use this framework to help writers? We can help them prioritize what we know will move them forward. We want to create a dialogue between the writer and their writing and help them hear the page talk back to them. That helps to move them into that knowledge transforming stage. And when I say help them, what I mainly mean is notice when they're starting to do that and point it out and say, that's good, do more of that. And the second thing that we can do is to give them readers by any means necessary. So the first one helps move them from knowledge telling to knowledge transforming, and the second one, giving them readers, that starts building them a reader representation of the text much sooner than you might expect, a stable reader representation of the text in their brain that they can think about as they are writing. A lot of us probably have some representation, reader representation in the back of our brain that is a writing instructor that we had at some point who was very formative for us, and we will hear them say, you're using the passive voice, don't do that, I told you not to do that. So that's the kind of thing that we're trying to get in there that will not necessarily hector them, but that will be a presence for them that they can have active in their working memory as they are composing and revising. Now, it's important that we be mindful of our own priorities here too. Something else that we know from research into writing instruction is that teachers are apt to focus on small scale issues like grammar at the expense of larger scale issues like content and meaning. We know from the research that students assume whatever we spend the most time and ink on is the most important thing they need to address. So many of them spend the bulk of their energy fixing grammar and mechanical mistakes, or trying to, without ever engaging with the actual meaning of their ideas to improve them. So this creates a vicious circle where good writing becomes identified as surface level work, and the real cognitive work of writing is neglected entirely. Grammar and mechanics are absolutely important, but they're only important because they can affect comprehension. So the simple solution, the way to cover all the bases, is to address grammar and mechanics most of the time in the context of reader confusion. We'll talk about a little bit more about that in just a second. So responding as a reader. The way I do that is I tend to foreground the reader's confusion as the problem rather than correctness. So rather than saying, you know, you have a comma splice here, I might say, this sentence seems really long. I got lost. I couldn't tell in the first half how it was connected to the second, or who was doing what to whom. So that's a simpler way of saying it. You don't have to worry about all the grammatical terms, and it helps the student figure out how they need to fix the sentence, which comma splice, you know, then you have to start getting into what a semicolon does, and it's different in America than it is in British English, and you don't even want to mess with that. So you have dual benefits from responding as a reader. You get to provide a concrete example of a reader reaction to the text, and you get to direct the writer back to the words on the page to reassess their potential meanings, which is where knowledge transforming happens. Okay, another thing that I recommend is illuminate potential misreadings. Looks like you get to see PowerPoint's judgments about my spelling also. Show students how readers could stray off the writer's intended path. So you could say, when you wrote, she fed steak to her dog in a silver bowl, I thought the dog was in the bowl. Dog's not in the bowl, right? Where's the dog? How do we need to change that to make me get to see the right thing? And help them hear small scale problems. So reading a sentence or two aloud to highlight missing words or agreement problems is usually much quicker and less frustrating for everyone. Remember, Ong says you have to anticipate all the ways a reader could misinterpret your text. Well, just show the student the interpretations that you came up with, and then get them to help you find the right one, then write it more clearly with better signposts for the reader. And it's helpful too to find ways, especially now that we're in a virtual environment, to communicate that reader confusion or comprehension problems through vocal inflection or facial expression. So the research that I've done indicates that when you write comments, you lose a lot of really valuable data that can help the student figure out what the reader needs, that is communicated through vocal inflection, just speaking, and facial expression. So one thing I do with student papers a lot of times is I'll just give them a video of me literally reading the paper, and they see my face as I'm reading every sentence, and they see like my eyes tracking back and forth when I get stuck in a sentence, and they see the expressions that I make when I'm trying to understand or I don't understand. And they also see all the places where I nod my head where they made a great point. All these things give them a really rich source of data about how the reader is reacting, but because it's fairly emotional input that's processed through different parts of the brain and the prefrontal cortex, it frees up some bandwidth for the thinky parts of the brain to work with the words at the same time. That is my professional, not a cognitive therapist, cognitive psychologist way of explaining that phenomenon. Okay, so that responding in that way is really all you have to do to help students revise drafts to improve clarity, development, organization, style, diction, and sentence effectiveness, which is what the text asks you to do. The bonus here is that helping a reader understand what I'm trying to say is a much more rewarding task for writers than correcting grammar. And that is a lot more likely to keep them engaged on that 10,000 hour journey that we're talking about. I remind students that reading is hard work. If they see me reading their paper and they see me struggling, like they get that I really was trying. E.B. White says the average reader is in trouble about half the time, and I find that that's true. Likewise, reminding them that readers have definite expectations, and when those expectations are not met, confusion and misreading result. So it's not just that you were wrong, you got the grammar wrong, but the reader, you missed the connection and they want to connect with you, so go back and try again. And it's important to show, not tell here. So show them the reader's confusion, show them that the audience expected something else. And then you're reframing error correction in a much more positive way. It's much more likely to motivate them, in my experience. Okay, also we can use questions to encourage knowledge transforming behavior. So if you just see a tangled sentence, ask, did you mean X or did you mean Y? Did you mean that the dog was in the bowl or was the steak in the bowl? That can be a productive way just to start getting the sentence untangled. But double benefit here, it can also reveal places where the writer isn't really sure what they mean yet, or maybe they mean both things. And that's a sign that they're in transit between the two stages, and you can push them to do more of the knowledge transforming. If you're not sure which it is, write a little bit more about each possibility. You don't have to just pick one, right? It's important to note that a lot of students at this stage, if you say, did you mean this or that? It could be both. You say, this is like a great thing. Hey, it could be both. A lot of them will go, I'm just taking the whole sentence out because I don't want to mean two things, right? They'll just excise the text that raises new potential meanings because it can feel safer and more likely to be correct. And so you may have to convince them that expressing complicated ideas actually is their goal. And even though it's harder work, it's important that they do it. So help kind of talk them through that. That can be a stage where stepping back from the page a little bit and having them talk through the idea. And maybe you can make some notes as they're talking or ask them to write something down when they say it clearly. That can be helpful because when they realize they've written something that has two different meanings, they look at the page sort of opening up as this kind of like bear trap that's going to grab them. Get them away from the written word and let them vocalize for a while. They're usually more fluent that way. And then they may be able to work through some more complicated ideas and then get it down on paper. But I always tell them at these moments, you catch them being smart and then just get them to do more of that. But they have to know that something that could mean two things is not necessarily bad. It can be great. They've got to go into it. They've got to go and find out. Okay, and using peer review, you may not have abundant resources to teach writing with, but most of us have lots of students. So let them be readers for each other. The research shows that the benefits of peer review don't necessarily come from the students giving one another brilliant advice about their writing. The primary benefit seems to come from the experience of looking at the writing of someone who is engaged in the same task as you and trying to express what worked or didn't work about it and why and how it could be better. So that really seems to move the needle developmentally. Just trying to articulate as a reader what is clear or not clear about it. And it gives students too, excuse me, a better understanding of that the reader has expectations, the reader gets confused, the reader needs help. And those are all things that will help them keep that reader representation active in their memory as they work. Simply reading their work aloud will help them find and correct a lot of problems. I'm sure a lot of you already know that and do that, even if the listener doesn't say anything, just reading it. For more advanced peer review, you want to give students specific guidance. And if you've used peer review and not been satisfied with it, that's probably an area that you want to think about new frameworks for managing peer review. I have put at the end of this presentation, there's a slide with a link to Shelley Reed's peer review page at George Mason, which is a wonderful resource. Lots of different ways to go through peer review and set it up depending on your specific goals. And finally, help students prioritize. So when a student receives feedback, you want to try and help them make a plan to do something with it. Sometimes we say, you may just give them 3 things to work with, or ask them, what's the first thing you're going to work on? What do you think is the most important thing? What do you think will be the hardest? But if they can walk away with a concrete idea of their next few steps, they're much more likely to engage productively in the revision process. So those are my key recommendations for working with student writing, to kind of identify these moments in the text and get students to dig into them and push them further along the path. So we are just, hey, wow, my timing came out much better than I expected.